The courtroom of the Supreme Court was immersed in complete silence, an almost reverent hush that seemed to settle over everyone present, as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stood with quiet confidence at the lawyer's table. Her voice was steady and clear, unwavering despite the fact that Justice Samuel Alito had interrupted her for the third time within a span of just 5 minutes. For many months leading up to this pivotal day, Justice Alito, widely regarded as a conservative voice on the bench, had been delivering increasingly provocative and controversial public speeches. His remarks had often raised eyebrows and ignited debates about the role of judicial impartiality, stirring questions about whether judges should openly lean toward one side politically or remain strictly neutral. Today, during this critical legal proceeding, a case that could influence voting rights across the nation, Justice Alito's visible frustration with Crockett's meticulous and well-reasoned explanation of her case was palpable. He dismissed her arguments with evident dismissiveness, abruptly claiming, "That's not what the Constitution says," before cutting her off mid-sentence, as if to silence her entirely. This sudden interruption drew a heightened sense of tension into the room, causing everyone to hold their breath, waiting to see how Crockett would respond. She paused briefly, her face calm but resolute, and fixed her gaze directly on the stern face of the justice. Carefully and deliberately, she reached into a leather folder that had remained untouched until this specific moment. From inside, she extracted a singular document, something of immense importance that she was about to bring into the magnifying glass of the court's scrutiny. Without haste, she started to speak again, her words measured and precise, but commanding enough to immediately capture everyone's full attention in that silent chamber. What unfolded in those following 30 seconds was nothing short of historic. In that fleeting yet powerful moment, Crockett's composed assertion not only silenced Justice Alito, but also revealed a profound truth that would resonate throughout the fabric of the federal judiciary, casting a long shadow that would be examined in countless cases for years into the future. This was a defining moment, one that would be remembered as a turning point in the ongoing conversation about judicial conduct, voting rights, and constitutional interpretation. Long before she stepped up to speak in this courtroom, Jasmine Crockett had already established herself as a formidable mind in legal circles. Her extensive background as a public defender and a civil rights attorney, with a particular focus on cases involving voting rights, gave her a deep and nuanced understanding of constitutional law. Her expertise was far beyond the typical experience of many elected officials, blending practical litigation skills with a profound grasp of legal principles rooted in constitutional history. Even after choosing to serve as a congresswoman, she had not severed her ties to the legal profession. She maintained her law license and occasionally took on cases of exceptional constitutional significance, including this current challenge against a restrictive and controversial state voting law. Her involvement was driven not only by her political role, but also by her genuine commitment to defending and expanding voting rights as a fundamental pillar of democracy. At the same time, Justice Samuel Alito had been making headlines in recent months, often for reasons beyond his judicial rulings. His public appearances, notably at meetings organized by the Federalist Society, had increasingly reflected partisan tendencies. During a recent speech at such an event, he expressed skepticism about efforts to expand voting rights, casting doubt on reforms aimed at increasing electoral participation. His remarks raised eyebrows among political observers and legal scholars alike, leading many to question whether he could remain unbiased when ruling on cases that involved voting rights issues, the very issues he had publicly discussed and arguably politicized. Several complaints concerning his conduct and impartiality had been filed with the appropriate judicial oversight bodies. However, the absence of a binding ethics code for Supreme Court justices meant that these allegations largely remained unaddressed, leaving his reputation somewhat clouded in controversy. Just 3 weeks earlier, Alito had publicly made statements asserting that the procedures designed to safeguard the electoral process were, in his view, unnecessary, or potentially discriminatory. Modern attempts to characterize basic security measures as forms of discrimination, he argued in a speech, would have puzzled the framers of the Constitution, who understood the importance of maintaining the integrity of voting. His comments were seen by many legal experts across a broad political spectrum as prejudging issues that were likely to reach the Supreme Court in the near future. Critics argued that such remarks exhibited a predisposition, hinting at a bias that could influence his deliberations on cases involving voting rights and election procedures. Behind the scenes, Crockett had been methodically preparing not only her legal arguments for this contentious case, but also conducting thorough research into the historical and constitutional context of the very provisions Justice Alito claimed to be defending. Her dual role as a lawmaker and an experienced attorney provided her with a unique perspective, allowing her to analyze the case from both practical governance and constitutional law angles. She understood that the constitutional text, history, and original intent could serve as powerful tools in challenging restrictive voting laws. Her preparation involved delving into archives, legal precedents, and scholarly commentary, equipping herself to present a compelling, well-founded challenge to the state's efforts to curb voting access. The courtroom itself was densely packed, filled with legal experts, civil rights advocates, reporters, and observers eager to witness what promised to be a landmark case. Given the importance and the high-profile nature of the matter, the Chief Justice had granted extra time for each side to present their arguments. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, as everyone recognized that the outcome could significantly influence future legal standards on voting rights and the proper role of the judiciary. Expectations ran high among all parties involved, and the tension in the room was palpable, a testament to the case's far-reaching implications for democracy and the rule of law in the United States. As Crockett approached the podium to present her arguments before the Supreme Court, a ripple of hushed whispers spread among the spectators and courtroom attendees. Many in the chamber anticipated that Justice Alito, renowned for his assertive and sometimes confrontational questioning of advocates representing liberal positions, would dominate the proceedings with his pointed inquiries and rigorous scrutiny. The scene was set for what seemed likely to be another example of the heightened partisan tensions that had, over recent years, increasingly come to define the operations and debates within the nation's highest judicial authority. When Congresswoman Crockett began to speak, the atmosphere in the courtroom was palpably tense, charged with anticipation and a hint of underlying conflict. Unlike some of her predecessors, who had often been thrown off course or left flustered by Justice Alito's relentless and sometimes sharp questioning, she commenced her oral argument with a calm composure, choosing to open not with abstract legal citations, but with a heartfelt narrative illustrating the human consequences of the voting restrictions that lay at the core of the case. Her words carried the weight of real people affected by the legal dispute, which immediately caught the attention of the court. She addressed the Chief Justice directly, her voice steady, clear, and measured, as she began. "Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court, the fundamental right to vote is the bedrock upon which all other constitutional rights are built and protected." With this opening statement, she underscored the importance of the issue at hand. She then proceeded to highlight a concrete example. Last November, in Jefferson County, a total of 53,000 eligible voters were unjustly prevented from casting their ballots. This incident was not merely a numerical statistic. It was a stark failure of our constitutional safeguards. It represented a breach, not just for those 53,000 citizens, but for our entire democratic system, the very principles of fairness, equality, and representation that our Constitution enshrines. Her words resonated with a slight nod from several justices, who recognized the gravity of her presentation. Having established the human stakes involved, Crockett then shifted seamlessly into the legal terrain, carefully unpacking the constitutional arguments. She addressed the response from the state, which relied heavily on the provision in Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution, claiming it grants state legislatures near absolute authority when setting voting procedures. But Crockett challenged this narrowly drawn interpretation by emphasizing that such an argument neglects the broader constitutional context, particularly the guarantees embedded within the 14th Amendment, which ensures equal protection under the law. Throughout her explanation, Justice Alito eventually interrupted, his tone dismissive, with a dismissive wave of the hand. "This is merely an inconvenience," he asserted confidently, "not a constitutional violation. Every election regulation imposes some degree of burden, unless you can demonstrate that it stems from deliberate discrimination, something your evidence does not support. These choices by state legislatures remain within the constitutional bounds." Despite this interruption, Crockett maintained her composure, responding with poise and clarity. She addressed the justices directly, saying, "With respect, Justice Alito, I am not questioning the constitutional framework itself, but I am advocating for a comprehensive reading of it, one that recognizes the interplay between the original text and the amendments that fundamentally altered the balance of federal and state authority over elections." She continued by explaining in detail how the Reconstruction Amendments, the 14th and 15th, particularly curtailed the powers of individual states to enact voting laws that could discriminate against certain groups. She referenced debates from the Reconstruction era, the choices and concerns expressed by Congress, and supporting precedents established by prior Supreme Court decisions. Justice Elena Kagan nodded appreciatively, recognizing the historical importance of Crockett's contextualization, while Justice Brett Kavanaugh took notes, evidently engaged in the depth of her legal reasoning. Crockett then turned to specific provisions of the voting laws in question, namely the voter ID requirements, and articulated how these impose unfair and unnecessary burdens on minority voters, effectively suppressing their voting rights. Justice Alito, showing impatience once more, interrupted from his seat. "These are merely inconveniences," he declared with conviction, "not violations of the Constitution. Every election law imposes some form of burden. Unless there is clear evidence of intentional discrimination, these policies are within the legitimate powers of the state legislatures, and they should be accepted as such." Remaining composed, Crockett responded, "With respect, Justice Alito, precedent from cases such as Anderson v. Baird has established that even policies enacted without explicit discriminatory intent must be scrutinized if they impose undue burdens on the fundamental right to vote. Such regulations cannot be justified solely by a purported legitimate interest of the state if they restrict access unjustly. It is the role of this court to ensure that the constitutional protections for voting rights are upheld, even when state authorities argue in their favor." Throughout her presentation, Crockett demonstrated not only a deep understanding of both the constitutional language and its historical evolution, but also a commitment to advocating for the rights of ordinary citizens whose voices could be silenced by restrictive laws. Her careful, well-reasoned approach served as a reminder of the core principles of justice that underpin the nation's democratic processes, principles that protect every eligible voter's right to participate freely and fairly in the electoral process. The compelling evidence we have carefully laid out clearly illustrates that the government's interest in preventing electoral fraud is fundamentally and unquestionably self-evident, standing as an irrefutable principle that does not require further justification. When Alito interrupted for the third time, his demeanor betrayed a growing sense of frustration, which gradually became more noticeable and harder to conceal. It seemed as though the repeated interruptions reflected not only impatience, but a desire to steer the discussion in a different direction, possibly to obscure the core issues at hand. In this context, it is crucial to remember that the United States Constitution does not promise convenience or ease of procedure. Rather, it assigns specific powers and responsibilities to different branches of government. As a representative of the Congress, the Congresswoman's role is to interpret and exercise the authority granted to her by constitutional and legislative frameworks, which inherently include the allocation of powers to various entities. Most importantly, in this particular case, those powers primarily reside with state legislatures, which traditionally have held the primary responsibility for overseeing electoral processes within their jurisdictions. The fact that she was referred to using her congressional title instead of her role as a member of the local council or city authority drew the attention of those observing the proceedings. Such an unusual deviation from standard courtroom protocol appeared to serve a specific purpose, that of emphasizing her position as a federal representative, rather than highlighting her role as a legal professional or municipal official. Crockett, sensing the gravity of the moment, paused briefly. Her expression was resolute and unwavering, conveying a firm belief in the importance of her statements as she looked directly into the eyes of Justice Alito. She addressed him with clarity, emphasizing that the Constitution is not solely about granting authority to various branches or levels of government. Its primary purpose is to impose necessary limits designed to safeguard fundamental rights, those rights that must remain protected from overreach or abuse. However, given that Alito had introduced a line of questioning concerning the original design and intentions behind the constitutional framework, Crockett believed it pertinent to delve deeper into the historical record. She then reached into a leather folder, which had remained untouched until this pivotal moment, and carefully extracted a single document. Her voice carried a tone of deliberate assurance as she explained, "I have taken the liberty of researching the original sources that directly inspired the Reconstruction Amendments, especially as they relate to the authority of states over election processes." Her scholarly approach aimed to clarify misconceptions and shed light on the true intent of these constitutional provisions. Turning her attention to Justice Alito, she continued, "You have repeatedly suggested today, as well as in recent public statements, that the original understanding of the Constitution granted the states nearly unlimited authority when it comes to determining voting procedures." Her words were measured but authoritative, reflecting confidence grounded in historical evidence. She then brought forth the transcripts of congressional debates from the year 1869, in which the nation was deliberating the ratification of the 15th Amendment. Carefully lifting a document filled with highlighted sections, Crockett explained, "Allow me to draw your attention to this particular record." Among the most significant statements was that of Senator Oliver Morton, a principal architect of the amendment, who explicitly declared that the amendment's purpose was, and I quote, "to place the power to protect the right to vote in the proper hands of the federal government, where it rightfully belongs, rather than leaving that critical responsibility solely to the discretion of individual state legislatures, many of whom have demonstrated themselves unworthy of maintaining that trust." As she read, the chamber fell into a profound silence. Even the most attentive members seemed momentarily struck by the clarity and seriousness of her words. Justice Alito, visibly shifting in his seat, appeared to absorb the weight of these arguments. Crockett pressed on, emphasizing her point further. She pointed to other statements from the same debates, including that of James Garfield, who would go on to become the President of the United States, who declared that the time has come to establish a constitutional principle that will supersede all state regulations which impose burdens on the exercise of the franchise due to circumstances that are not directly inherent to the act of voting itself. Her tone reinforced the importance of creating a national standard that would prevent states from enacting procedures designed unfairly to impede eligible voters. Turning a second page of her carefully prepared notes, Crockett highlighted the most compelling evidence relevant to the case. She cited Senator William Stewart, who had played a significant role in drafting the language of the amendment, and who explicitly addressed the question of whether states could impose procedural hurdles that would effectively nullify a citizen's right to vote. She quoted his words verbatim, "We are establishing not just a negative prohibition against explicit racial barriers, but an affirmative principle, namely, that the right to vote must be practically accessible to all citizens, irrespective of their social or economic status." Her words underscored the shift from merely banning certain discriminatory practices to affirmatively ensuring voting rights are achievable for everyone. As Crockett spoke, several justices, including Chief Justice Roberts, leaned forward, closely examining the documents in her hands. Responding to her presentation, Crockett handed copies of the documents to the court clerk for distribution among the justices, facilitating their review. The atmosphere grew more intense and focused, as everyone in the courtroom recognized that the historical records she cited provided crucial insight into the intentions of the framers. This evidence aimed to clarify that the original constitutional understanding was far from granting unchecked, unlimited authority to the states over voting rights. Instead, it underscores the importance of establishing clear, federal standards designed to protect the fundamental right to vote, ensuring its practical accessibility for all eligible citizens across the nation. Justice Kagan cast a meaningful, deliberate glance toward Justice Stowe, signaling a silent yet powerful exchange of understanding between them. The gravity of the moment was clear, as their eye contact conveyed volumes about the weight of the discussion unfolding within the chamber. These exchanges are not mere formalities. They reflect the depth of the judicial deliberation and the careful consideration of complex issues at stake. Meanwhile, Justice Crockett, her tone growing more confident and assertive, emphasized to Justice Alito that the sources she was referencing are by no means obscure or dubious. With clarity and conviction, she explained that these references are, in fact, the very words of the original architects of the Reconstruction Amendments, the framers who painstakingly drafted and ratified these pivotal constitutional provisions. They are not vague or indirect. They are explicit, unambiguous statements directly from those who shaped the foundational laws of the nation. Justice Crockett pointed out that these historical sources directly contradict the narrow interpretation Justice Alito, Crockett, explained, her voice gaining tone and resonance as she laid out her argument. She emphasized that these sources, these clear, authoritative records, stand in stark opposition to the restrained and limited reading of the amendments that Justice Alito and others have been advocating both during their court appearances and in various recent public statements. She proceeded to underscore a crucial point. The Constitution's historical record leaves no room for misinterpretation. The members of Congress, during the era of Reconstruction, intentionally crafted laws that limited what states could do regarding voting regulations, not because they simply wanted to prevent explicit racial discrimination, but because they recognized the danger inherent in seemingly neutral procedures. These procedures, if left unchecked, could be manipulated to suppress ballot access for minority groups and other marginalized populations. She elaborated that Congress's intent was broader and more proactive than mere prohibition of overt discrimination. Instead, they established a federal interest, an affirmative obligation, to ensure voters could participate meaningfully in elections without facing barriers designed to undermine their fundamental right. Turning her attention to particular factual evidence in the case, Crockett explained that in Jefferson County, a significant disparity existed. Over 83% of voters denied access under the challenged law were members of minority groups, even though minorities constituted only about a third of the county's total population. This stark statistical imbalance alone, this glaring disparity, would have incensed the original framers of the 15th Amendment. They had explicitly rejected the idea that states could use procedural mechanisms as a means of bypassing the protections against racial discrimination, mechanisms that might not be overtly discriminatory at first glance, but serve the same purpose through indirect means. Their intent was clear. States should not be allowed to institute constitutional loopholes that enable indirect disenfranchisement. Justice Barrett, quietly observing the exchange, but now deciding to speak for the first time, acknowledged the compelling nature of Crockett's historical citations. She posed a practical question aimed at understanding how these historical insights should influence the court's legal standards in the present case. Addressing the question with composure, Crockett expressed gratitude and proceeded to clarify her position. She explained that these historical sources effectively demonstrate that when courts review voting regulations, a standard of heightened scrutiny should be applied whenever such regulations produce significant disparities in vote access. It should not matter whether the discriminatory results are driven by explicit discriminatory intent. What matters is the outcome, namely, the unequal impact on minority voters and other disenfranchised groups. Crockett emphasized that the framers of the Reconstruction Amendments understood very well that the right to vote is foundational. Indeed, it preserves all other rights Americans cherish. Because of its central importance, this right requires the highest level of protection against procedural obstacles. Any rules or regulations that significantly hinder or limit access to the ballot. These protections are especially vital in cases where seemingly neutral laws result in unequal burdens on different racial or social groups. Justice Alito, attempting to steer the discussion away from the historical record, remarked that these references, while interesting, are somewhat peripheral. He asserted that they do not override the clear language of Article 1 of the Constitution, which delineates the powers granted to Congress and the federal government. Yet, Crockett gently interrupted, her tone calm and measured, to correct this perception. She explained that these historical sources are far from being footnotes. Rather, they are the authoritative explanations of the original meaning of the Constitution, written and ratified by those who shaped our fundamental legal framework. These sources, testimonies from the very people who drafted and approved the amendments, directly address the relationship between the powers granted to Congress in Article 1 and the limitations imposed by subsequent amendments designed specifically to restrict those powers when it comes to voting rights. Finally, Crockett presented her concluding point with force and clarity. She stated that the Reconstruction Amendments fundamentally transformed the structure of American constitutional law. They introduced new limitations on state authority, explicitly in the domain of voting rights. To interpret Article 1's provisions as though these amendments did not exist would be a distortion, an act of cherry-picking the constitutional text instead of considering it in its full historical and legal context. Such an approach would amount to what she described as selective constitutionalism, a departure from both textualism and originalism, which seek to understand and uphold the original intent and meaning of the constitutional provisions. Her words dropped with quiet yet undeniable strength into the chamber, reaffirming the importance of recognizing the amendment's enduring influence on our constitutional system. Several of the law clerks seated quietly in the back rows of the courtroom visibly reacted to the powerful and compelling presentation delivered during the proceedings. Justice Clarence Thomas, who is known for his rare moments of verbal participation during oral arguments, subtly raised his eyebrows, an expression that conveyed both surprise and perhaps a renewed interest in the argument being advanced. Recognizing the importance of this particular moment, Chief Justice John Roberts made a rare and noteworthy decision to grant Crockett an additional 5 minutes of speaking time, extending her presentation. This gesture was unusual in the high-stakes environment of the Supreme Court and served as a silent acknowledgement of how profoundly her case was impacting the court's considerations. Following this, Crockett proceeded in a calm, deliberate manner, carefully weaving together historical insights with the specific legal evidence at hand, illustrating how the state's voter ID law imposed procedural requirements that closely resembled the kinds of barriers the Reconstruction Amendments sought to abolish. She emphasized that such burdens on voters directly conflict with the fundamental intentions of the constitutional framers who drafted those amendments. As her argument neared its conclusion, she gazed intently at the entire bench of justices and declared, without hesitation, that the case was not simply about balancing convenience against security, an often cited framing, but about something more profound. It was about whether the court would uphold the core promise embedded in the Reconstruction Amendments, a solemn commitment to ensure that the right to vote remains a meaningful, accessible guarantee for all citizens, no matter their race, economic status, or social class. With her voice steady and confident, she gathered her documents as her allotted time came to an end, preparing to deliver what would become a closing line that resonated deeply and left the courtroom in a profound hush. Her words made it palpably clear that the framers of the 15th Amendment, crafted in the aftermath of the Civil War, would undoubtedly recognize the current practices of Jefferson County today. The critical question confronting this court was whether it possessed the constitutional backbone and moral courage to see the circumstances as plainly as those statesmen did nearly 150 years ago. A collective intake of breath seemed to ripple through the chamber as everyone present absorbed the weight of her assertion. Justice Samuel Alito sat unmoving, visibly affected by the historical evidence Crockett presented, which undermined not only the line of questioning he had just engaged in, but also challenged many of his long-held public positions on voting rights. Meanwhile, other justices exchanged glances, their expressions hinting at the gravity of what they had just witnessed, a moment that underscored a pivotal shift in legal perspective. As Crockett slowly returned to her seat, the usual murmurs and whispers that often follow a compelling and provocative argument failed to materialize. Instead, the entire chamber lingered in solemn, almost sacred silence, fully absorbing the rare convergence where constitutional history, sharp legal reasoning, and moral conviction came together with such undeniable force. The significance of Congresswoman Crockett's historic argument before the Supreme Court extended far beyond the immediate case at hand. Her presentation ignited a renewed discourse on constitutional principles, especially concerning voting rights, and infused new vitality into the ongoing juristic conversations on protecting those rights. In the days that followed, legal scholars and commentators analyzed her contribution with great interest, dubbing her submission the Crockett Brief, a comprehensive written argument that not only complemented her oral presentation, but also offered a detailed expansion of the historical evidence she had introduced. Leading legal publications, such as the Harvard Law Review, dedicated special issues to examining the original sources from the Reconstruction era that Crockett had brought to light. Esteemed scholars known for their expertise in originalist jurisprudence acknowledged the importance of these materials, which had been largely overlooked in previous voting rights cases. Professor Acalamar of Yale Law School, writing in The Atlantic, remarked that what Crockett accomplished was nothing short of remarkable, emphasizing that she employed originalist methods to demonstrate that the true understanding of the Reconstruction Amendments was far more protective of voting rights than many modern jurists had acknowledged. Her analysis provided a masterclass in how historical evidence can serve to clarify and deepen our comprehension of constitutional meaning. The influence of her arguments became even more apparent approximately 3 months later, when the Supreme Court announced its decision in the case. The implications of her work had clearly begun to sway the court's reasoning and ultimate ruling. In an unexpectedly decisive ruling, the Supreme Court delivered a 6-3 opinion, with Chief Justice Roberts authoring the majority opinion and Justice Barrett providing a concurring statement. This decision boldly struck down the specific voting restrictions that had been challenged, effectively ruling them unconstitutional. More importantly, the court also established a new, more robust standard for reviewing and assessing the constitutionality of voting regulations that states might seek to implement in the future. According to the majority, whenever voting regulations produce evident and measurable disparities in the access to ballots and voting rights, courts must invoke a heightened level of scrutiny. This means that judicial review for such cases must be more rigorous, with a focus on ensuring that any state interest behind the regulations is truly compelling and, critically, that there are less restrictive means available to achieve these interests. When applying this standard, courts are required to evaluate whether the state's justifications for a regulation are not only substantial but also absolutely necessary, especially when the regulation in question restricts or complicates the process of voting. This revised standard of review draws directly from the original understanding of the Reconstruction-era amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, that fundamentally reshaped the balance of power between state sovereignty and federal authority regarding voting rights. These amendments aim to protect marginalized groups from discriminatory practices and unjust restrictions, establishing that any voting regulation that perpetuated inequality or disenfranchisement should be subject to rigorous scrutiny. The court's new stance reinforces this foundational principle, emphasizing that voting laws must serve a compelling interest and that their burdens on voters, especially those from historically disenfranchised communities, must be justified by the least restrictive means possible. What makes this ruling particularly notable is the presence of Justice Alito's concurrence rather than dissent, although he still maintained that states enjoy significant discretion when organizing and overseeing elections. Traditionally, Justice Alito had held a firm stance in favor of broad state authority over election administration, emphasizing states' rights to manage their electoral processes with minimal federal interference. However, in this case, he acknowledged that historical evidence, more thoroughly analyzed than in previous cases, demonstrates that certain restrictions placed on voting access, especially those impacting marginalized populations, are constrained by the original intent behind the Reconstruction Amendments. His concurrence signaled a subtle but important shift. It recognized that the history and purpose of these amendments impose meaningful limits on what states can justify when enacting voting laws that restrict access to the ballot. Legal scholars and observers reacted immediately and with considerable interest, recognizing the magnitude of this judicial development. Nina Tottenberg, a prominent legal analyst from NPR, remarked that this decision represented arguably the most significant recalibration in the jurisprudence surrounding voting rights in recent decades. Her assessment underscored how the court's new approach had the potential to influence the legal landscape for years to come. Moreover, Richard Hast, a respected constitutional law scholar, argued that Justice Crockett, who was involved in the case, didn't just secure a victory for her client but fundamentally shifted the broader constitutional dialogue about voting rights, opening doors for new interpretations and protections rooted in history and principle. For Justice Crockett herself, participating in the oral arguments and contributing to such a consequential decision became a landmark moment in her already distinguished public career. Although she continued her service in Congress, her role during the case highlighted her expertise in constitutional law and her deep understanding of voting rights issues. Her powerful courtroom performance and her profound grasp of historical context inspired many, especially women of color, to pursue careers in law and public service. Following her appearance at the Supreme Court, law schools across the nation reported a noticeable surge in applications from women of diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds, many of whom openly cited Justice Crockett's advocacy and performance as a motivating influence. Sherilyn, a former director of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, explained at a public forum hosted by Georgetown Law that Crockett's demonstration was more than mere legal skill. It exemplified the importance of incorporating diverse perspectives into constitutional interpretation. Her lived experience as a Black woman from the southern United States, combined with her rigorous legal training and her political acumen, enabled her to see deep connections within our constitutional history that many others had overlooked. Crockett's unique vantage point allowed her to contextualize the legal arguments within a broader social and historical framework, thereby enriching the judicial discourse. The influence of Crockett's advocacy extended beyond the courtroom, affecting the ethical standards of the judiciary itself. Just 2 months after her successful argument, the Supreme Court announced the adoption of its first-ever binding code of conduct for justices. This new code introduced stricter guidelines for public appearances, speeches, and statements, emphasizing transparency and impartiality. It also established stronger standards for the avoidance of biases and conflicts of interest in judicial conduct. While none of the justices explicitly linked this reform to Crockett's case, many observers believed that her compelling demonstration of how public statements can impact perceptions of judicial fairness played a significant role. Her clear example demonstrated the importance of maintaining judicial impartiality, especially in high-stakes cases involving constitutional rights, which in turn motivated the court to implement reforms aimed at preserving the integrity and credibility of the judiciary. In sum, this landmark decision, marked by the court's reaffirmation of strong protections for voting rights and a newfound willingness to scrutinize state restrictions more stringently, represented a significant pivot in U.S. constitutional law. It built on the enduring legacy of the Reconstruction Amendments, recognized the importance of historical context, and acknowledged that ensuring equitable access to voting remains a fundamental purpose of our constitutional framework. The ruling, its accompanying concurrence, and the wider implications for judicial ethics and public trust signaled a promising step toward a more inclusive and just democratic process, one that respects both the letter and the spirit of the nation's foundational principles. Across numerous state legislatures throughout the United States, lawmakers have begun to revisit and scrutinize the procedures surrounding voting with a new, more attentive perspective, considering how different measures might impact various communities in uneven and often unintended ways. This renewed focus has led several states to undertake proactive reforms aimed at making voter identification requirements more accessible to a broader segment of the population, while simultaneously ensuring that the security of elections remains uncompromised. These reforms were often justified and guided by the evolving standards set forth by the Supreme Court, which had recently clarified the constitutional parameters within which such regulations could be enacted, serving as a guiding beacon for policymakers striving to balance accessibility with integrity. Initially, legal scholars on the conservative side of the ideological spectrum responded defensively to the approach advocated by Crockett, who championed an originalist interpretation of constitutional provisions. However, over time, a shift began to occur within this community. Many began to recognize that her method, rooted in a deep and rigorous examination of historical sources, maintained an impressive consistency with classical legal reasoning. Her approach was not merely an exercise in historical curiosity, but a serious, methodical endeavor to uncover the original intentions of the Constitution's framers, particularly concerning the Reconstruction Amendments. At a prominent conference organized by the Federalist Society, which often serves as a platform for conservative legal thought, well-respected originalist scholar Randy Barnett openly acknowledged her contributions. He stated that Crockett's work served as a powerful reminder of the importance of intellectual honesty, insisting that true fidelity to constitutional principles requires following the evidence of history wherever it may lead, even if that path leads away from preferred or preconceived outcomes. Barnett, among other experts, emphasized that her meticulous research into the original understanding of the Reconstruction Amendments, especially the 15th, 14th, and 13th Amendments, deserved serious consideration from all constitutional scholars, regardless of their ideological leanings. Her method, which combined rigorous historical investigation with contemporary legal analysis, set a new standard in the field and soon became a mainstay in major civil rights litigation. Law clinics affiliated with leading American universities recognized the significance of her approach by establishing dedicated projects aimed at unearthing overlooked or underappreciated historical materials relevant to various constitutional questions. These efforts contributed to a growing body of knowledge that illuminated the intentions of the framers at the time of Reconstruction, offering fresh insights into long-standing legal debates. For ordinary Americans, particularly those living in communities with a history of voter suppression or disenfranchisement, the influence of her work proved both tangible and symbolic. In the election that followed her landmark case, voter turnout in Jefferson County soared, with many first-time voters explicitly citing her legal victory and the principles it represented as their motivation to participate in the democratic process. Crockett herself clarified that her work was not driven by partisan politics or the desire to gain electoral advantage, but by a fundamental commitment to ensuring that the Constitution fulfills its highest purpose, to protect the basic rights of all citizens. In a documentary produced by PBS Frontline commemorating the first anniversary of her successful case, Crockett explained that her primary concern was safeguarding the right to vote as the cornerstone of democracy, an essential right that, once secured, underpins all other liberties and protections. When Crockett was called upon 2 years later to present another case before the Supreme Court, the overall atmosphere and tone of the court's deliberations had markedly shifted. This time, Justice Alito approached her arguments with a tone of respectful engagement, thoughtfully examining her historical evidence and legal reasoning. Several other justices made references to her previous scholarship, acknowledging her contributions and the depth of her research. Observation by legal commentators indicated that the court's entire approach to questions surrounding voting rights had undergone a significant transformation, moving towards a more historically grounded and principle-based analysis. As a result, the case quickly became a landmark, illustrating how her originalist methodology had begun to influence judicial thinking at the highest levels. The influence of her work extended beyond the courtroom, as constitutional law professors across the nation incorporated her case into their teaching. Many emphasized that Crockett's most important contribution was not merely securing a single victory, but expanding the collective understanding of what the Constitution truly means. Her emphasis on recovering the voices, perspectives, and intentions of the Reconstruction-era framers helped to restore a richer, more complete vision of America's constitutional development. Her efforts made it evident that, contrary to the misconception that the Constitution is a static document frozen in the year 1787, it is actually a living, evolving framework, one that incorporates the transformative amendments enacted after the Civil War, which deeply reshaped the nation's legal and moral landscape. What initially began as a tense and sometimes contentious legal confrontation in the Supreme Court transformed over time into something far more profound and enduring, a powerful reminder that the Constitution's true strength lies in its capacity to grow and adapt, while staying rooted in the original principles that underpin democracy and equality. Crockett's work highlighted that the Constitution is not merely a relic of the past, but a living instrument, continually shaped by the voices of those who fought to expand its promise of justice and liberty for all. Her legacy underscored that each generation, through dedicated scholarship, prudent interpretation, and courageous lawyering, has the capacity to expand and deepen the noble promise contained within America's foundational document. The amendment in question was crafted with a very specific purpose in mind: to make American democracy truly more open, more inclusive, and more representative of all its citizens, rather than allowing it to become more exclusive or limited. It was not merely a legal modification or a procedural adjustment. It was a deliberate effort to expand the fundamental principles upon which the nation was founded, ensuring that the voice and rights of every individual would be recognized and protected. In this context, Crockett's victory was far more significant than just winning a simple legal argument. It represented a profound return to the core constitutional ideals that had, for far too long, been overshadowed and sometimes even distorted within the halls of courtrooms and the classrooms across the country. Her successful intervention helped rekindle a vision rooted in the original intent of the framers of the Constitution, a vision that prioritized equality, justice, and the promise of equal protection under the law, a vision that had been somewhat obscured or neglected in recent times. When Crockett addressed the justices at the end of her argument, her final words lingered in the air, becoming a powerful touchstone for expanding discussions about how the Constitution should be interpreted and understood in the modern era. Her remarks served as a reminder, a guiding beacon, for those engaged in the ongoing debate over the fundamental principles of American law. Whether the Constitution is a living, breathing document that must be read and reinterpreted in the light of contemporary realities, or whether it is a fixed, unchanging charter. The inspiration behind her stance was rooted in the recognition that the framers of the 15th Amendment, which was ratified many decades earlier, would have looked upon today's circumstances with a mixture of familiarity and clarity. They would see the issues unfolding now, how rights are being expanded or challenged, and they would grasp the underlying truth of what is happening in the present moment. However, the central question remains: do we, as a nation, possess the constitutional courage necessary to recognize these developments with the same clarity and decisiveness as those who drafted the original amendments? Do we have the resolve to confront the difficult truths and the complex realities of modern society and interpret the Constitution accordingly? This challenge was not directed solely at the 9 justices sitting on the highest court of the land. It was a call to the entire nation, a challenge to a country still in the process of living up to the promises enshrined in its founding documents. It was an appeal for collective bravery to pursue justice, equality, and fairness, even when such pursuits require difficult decisions or uncomfortable truths. Such a challenge does not end with one court session, nor does it dissolve with the passing of time. Its echoes continue long after that historic day, influencing the ongoing development of the nation's legal and moral landscape. It is a reminder that the struggle for a truly inclusive and just democracy is a continuous journey, one that demands courage, perseverance, and unwavering faith in the principles on which America was built.